So let's repeat the question. We just reviewed what the term professional half-life means. And there are some endeavors in technology where the pace of change is very quick. So if it takes a medical doctor in healthcare 5 years to become incompetent, if they stop refreshing their professional development, if they stop going to conferences and learning about the newest, latest, greatest thing, it only takes 5 years for a medical doctor to become generically incompetent. And so in technology, in certain disciplines, it takes about 2 or 3 years. Networking is one of those. And I just asked, what was this word right up here? Can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah.
Yes. Revision.
Revision. Yeah. And can everybody see? It's kind of small, but it says 1 Charlie, 1C.
1C, yeah.
Okay. You're going to find that sometimes when you're reading the study guide, you get to a link and you click it and the link doesn't work. Or you find that I have a slide reference for the presentation slides. And when you go and you look, it doesn't really track with the topic. Now, in this case, the interest is Advanced Research Projects Agency, and we're talking about the origins of the internet. And if I go to slide 18, here we see a reference to ARPANET. So in this case, there is a correlation between the slide reference and my study guide. I want you to know that because of the nature of our discipline, you're not going to stop learning when you graduate your program. You're going to get into the workplace, and within 2 to 3 years, you're going to be stale if you don't keep learning on the job. And what I want to do is incentivize the content and knowledge improvement process, beginning with my own study guides. So I'm going to be constantly updating the content. You'll see revision 1D, 1E. Every now and then you'll see revision 2, which means, oh, I've kind of refactored the student, I've revised some of the student learning outcomes, right? Why am I telling you this? When you get to the point of the module where it's time for you to take the assessment, you want to make sure that you're using the latest version of the study guide, because it's not uncommon for minor revisions. It's more rare for major revisions in the content to happen while we're still in that module, right? So what may happen, I'll usually give people a heads up. I'll send an email. I'll say, hey, there's a new version of the study guide. Now, do you see here what revision I'm working on?
Revision 1B.
Yeah, 1B.
1B. But what am I using here?
1C.
1C, right? So let's say that you just discover this. You're in Blackboard and you look and you go, oh, there's a version difference in Blackboard. In our recorded session, he's using 1C, but this is an older version, right? Or when I'm in this version, I look, and when I click on the slide, it doesn't have anything to do with ARPANET. If you send me email with a screenshot, does everybody here know how to capture a screen?
Yeah. There's like 2 ways to do it though.
Yes. If you capture a screen and you say, hey, on this page of the study guide, and you just shoot me a screenshot, this slide reference right here. If you're the first to do it, I will post additional credit. So what'll happen is I'll, and depending on the size and nature of the discovery, we've had cases where a solution recording, a walkthrough for a solution, this is a 5-point assignment worth 5% of your final grade, right? People click on a link and the technology has changed, and somebody will email and they'll go, Hey, I don't know if anybody else has seen this, but in Packet Tracer, when you're creating this route with the router, those features on the screen with the new version of software are totally different. I can't really follow that. Well, holy buckets. If you send me that email and that screenshot, and you're the first person in there, I'm going to reward you for that, because I didn't know there was a new version that had different screen arrangements for the menus or the buttons, but that happens all the time. It happens all the time in our class. Here's a great example. Oracle. Do any of you use Oracle VirtualBox to run virtual machines?
Yes.
Yeah, we do that in IT, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the version changed. It was a whole version increase in the middle of the semester. And some of the solution walkthroughs that I had already recorded so that students could follow the step-by-step when they're doing their module solution, it didn't track. It was slightly different. So when people got to that one point, they were scratching their heads. I don't want the whole class to suffer, but I have no control over what innovations hit when in the technology industry. And I don't want to look like a doofus in front of my students. Does everybody understand what I'm getting at here?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is a collaborative process. We are partners in your career progression in this degree program. And I worked in industry for 25 years, and I can tell you things change in the blink of an eye. So when I come at this, I have a whole different modus operandi. I have a whole different way of operating. And I want you to take up some of the same habits, because they've served me well all the way up my career path. And I got as high as you could go in the IT industry, other than owning my own company. Okay. Are there any questions before we dive into the first student learning objective?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, another expectation that I have, I will call out specifics of the study guide. Occasionally, I'll go through the study guide on screen. I'll reference some slides, but I don't tend to review slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, slide 4, I tend to jump around. There in this one slide set for our module 1, I think there's 57 slides altogether. Yeah, 57 slides right up here. We're not going to have a class where I plow through 57 slides and then ask if there are any questions. Well, instead, I'm going to provide a verbal narrative about that student learning objective. And I'm going to point out some things in the study guide and on specific slides, but I'm not going to read it verbatim. And I expect you to take the time to read the whole thing. Okay. Now, why am I doing that? Here's something else I do a little differently than other instructors, and I've been beat up for it by my peers, by my colleagues. I've been criticized. Oh, this is a university. You don't want to pre-chew the food, so to speak, in the textbook. It's up to them to read the chapters in the textbook. And I'm like, well, this is a highly technical subject, and there's 1,200 pages. It's kind of like a jungle. And I think my role is more like a jungle guide. And I think if I can't take chapters 1 and 2 in the textbook and state some things in plain English so that the average person knows what it means, I'm not helping anybody achieve an understanding of the essentials. Does anyone recall my reference to something called mastery learning on Monday? I talked about mastery learning on Monday.
Yeah, mastery learning. Yes.
Mastery learning. Part of our challenge is to strike a balance in this class. You have an amazing textbook, an amazing reference written by a guy who's a pioneer in the industry, Comer. He is world renowned. However, it's not my expectation that you would memorize 1,500 pages, which is why I went to the trouble to condense the main ideas of chapters 1 and 2 and 2 sections in chapters 13. So when you see 13.2, that's the second section, chapter 13. The third section of chapter 13. Everybody got me?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, sir.
So what did I do? Oh, I just transported from chapter 1 and 2, and then I jumped all the way to the end of chapter 13. And if you're used to doing things in traditional classes, that can leave you behind. I want to call that out. And I want you to know that if I took the time to take 129 pages of world-class reference in an industry I spent 25 years earning my pay, I expect you to take the time during this week, not 17 minutes to glance through each page right before the assessment. I'm just being real here. I need you to commit to taking an honest hour to read 17 pages of something that's in plain English. Now, if you read a section of my study guide and it doesn't read like, I don't know, the average newspaper article, if you read something and it doesn't make any sense, highlight it, take a screenshot, say, were you doing a revision and you meant to finish this sentence? Or I don't get what I don't understand what you're saying here, right? Then I will post additional credit each and every time you do something like that, okay? But I just want to be clear about the expectations before we dive into this. We have how many student learning objectives? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 student learning objectives in the first module. And why is that important? Well, in the syllabus, every single one of the course objectives, right? Our course objectives, what are you going to learn while you're in here? Identify and explain network concepts, components, process, and standards. You know what standards are, right? Did you know that in the territory, we have lots of networks that are built and they're kind of just put together? Have you ever seen anything like that in your neighborhood? I mean, you get that impression. You're in a school, you're in a business, you're in a hotel, and you're looking and it's like, is that coat hanger wire or chicken wire or what? I mean, sometimes.
Well, I
Yeah.
grew up in Louisiana, so I
Oh.
haven't really like experienced that.
Yeah, and I did the last 25 years in IT in South Carolina. So I did see a lot of adaptive practices that did not comply with the standards, right? Every one of our module objectives should tie back to the course objectives, okay? So you're going to learn how to apply encryption, configure network components, analyze and troubleshoot networks so you can fix problems, right? But every one of the student learning objectives, the stuff that's in each, the stuff that's in each study guide, when you look online, I'm going to say over and over again, when you go into the module header, I'm going to say study as in memorize, verbatim. I want you to be able to recite what's in 17 because I spent a week building out module study guides for your benefit. And I'll be pissed with you if your first attempt at a module assessment, you score 40% and you glanced at it. I'm getting criticized by my colleagues because they claim I'm making it too easy for you. Let's prove them wrong together. Okay? I know this is a little edgy, but again, every now and then I'm going to try to keep it real. When it says memorize, now you also get to retake the assessment, okay? After you reconcile mistakes, you get to take another version of the assessment for the module. I think I mentioned that on Monday, yes?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other thing I'm going to ask you is don't abuse that either. If you have a busy work schedule and you didn't have the time, you didn't have the time. You're going to do the best you can. I get it. I was once a graduate student that didn't have enough food to keep from being hungry half the day. And I worked 3 jobs. I get it. So do what you can, but the way we have this content, now this is the optional stuff, right? So the resources do have the session recordings, and I haven't pushed Monday's session recording in here yet. I still have to reorganize these and move the ones from last season to a different folder. It's optional that you would go back to class recording if you're in the study guide and you're like, I don't get this, but then you go back to the recording. I often explain things further in our sessions, and that's often very helpful, right? So I just wanted to I wanted to stress again the difference between what's optional and what's required. Everything in here, you got to know it. Everything in here is nice to know if you have extra time. And I'm pretty sure we covered that on Monday, but in case you weren't with us Monday, I'm going to say that a few times along the way as new students enroll in the course. Any questions? All right, so let's take a stab at the first part of it. Digital communications and networking was a bit like the Stone Age or dinosaurs, in that our early communications history, the technology didn't really evolve very fast. Most of the technology that we enjoy today has developed or evolved only in the last 25 to 30 years. So we went from 0 to 100 in the last 3 decades. Until then, you may have heard your grandparents talk about the way things were back in the day with something called telecommunications. And telecommunications as an industry still exists. It's the telephone company, except now everybody talks about cellular. All right. There are houses. Is anybody here living in a home or an apartment or a condo that still has a landline, what we call a plain old telephone system, an original analog telephone on the wall?
It has one in
Yeah.
the dorms.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There's one in the dorms? It's a payphone or something?
It's like a dial, but it's like it's like kind of like a landline.
It's kind of like a landline. Okay. Now the university offices have a cable connected to a handset, but that voice station is digital now. So it's a voice over IP, or it's a network phone. So it's not technically like the old phones. I want to share with you something that to me is an amazing story, the history of our communications, and then so you can appreciate how dramatically different things are in the last 25 to 30 years. So Alexander Graham Bell was preceded by a gentleman by the name of Morse. And what he found out is that if you took copper wire, this was in the early 1800s, okay? If you took copper wire and you stretched it a distance between 2 towns, you could communicate very quickly, because before then, the only form of communication was the Pony Express, right? You would literally write something on a piece of paper, give it to a courier who rode a horse to the next town. Very slow. So Morse code was invented in the early 1800s. So a wire would be stretched on poles between towns, and there was a set of dots and dashes, meaning there was a little handset where you could press a button and it would create a tone. That kind of thing. If you've never heard of Morse code before, or you've always wondered what that's about, there is one in particular that is very, very important to learn. And I would be remiss in my duties recounting the dramatic history of our telecommunications industry if I did not take a brief moment and a little side trip in Google. So back in the day, the series of dots and dashes, you would press the button, you'd hold the button down a little longer, that's the dash. You'd hit the button quickly, that's the dot. If nobody's ever explained that to you before, now you have it. S is 3 short dots. Doot, doot, doot. O is 3 long dashes. So doot, 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 right? And then you repeat it. So SOS, it's that you, what do we use SOS for?
For help.
For help. Save our souls. It's an abbreviation that means save our souls or save our ship. It's also done with radio waves, and it's the same equipment. They use radio waves instead of wires, right? This is how people communicated. You had to basically create every letter you were trying to write to a person or every number, and people got very good at listening to it, interpreting it, and that kind of thing.
They use that in the military.
They use it in the military quite a bit as a fallback. If you lose everything and you still have flashes, you can do this with a flashlight. So it's possible for ships to signal distress with a flashlight by just going flash, 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 long flash, long flash, long flash, 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 which is SOS. Those are significant things to understand, because what came next was revolutionary. It takes 7 times, electricity can speed around the equator of the Earth 7 times in a single second. The speed of electricity travels at the speed of light, 186,242 miles per second. That's pretty darn fast. But what you didn't know was that when Alexander Graham Bell came along a few years later and invented the telephone, they found out they could use the same Morse code cable for voice. And they started putting cable everywhere. The amazing thing about this era was that in order to talk to somebody by voice, and this is called an analog method, you have to create an electric circuit from the one person who is calling to the person who is called. What am I saying? Does anyone here call people in the States?
Mm,
Do you have friends or family in the mainland?
yeah,
States?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So if we go back, if we dial it back 40, 50 years, when you picked up the phone and dialed the number of the person in the States, an electric circuit, a continuous electric wire had to be connected from the Virgin Islands across the Atlantic into the United States mainland through switching centers to the person who received the phone call.
But
And
aren't those run through conduits underwater?
they are run through conduits underwater and conduits in the ground. But the main point is that you had to have a copper wire, a copper metal wire, all the way from the Virgin Islands, all the way to, let's say you're calling somebody in Los Angeles. When you ring the phone company connects each of the different junctions along the way from the Virgin Islands to Los Angeles, 4,600 miles and back. The important point to remember is it's not a circuit unless there's a return wire. So it's not 4,600 miles of wire. It's 9,200 miles of wire connected from your handset to the person you're talking to in Los Angeles. Dang. That's a long
That's
way.
that's pretty long.
It's pretty long, and it's pretty wasteful in terms of resources. But it's what we knew. And it's what we knew for over 100 years. Over 100 years. When you see the reference to plain old telephone system, the common acronym is POTS, a POTS line. That's old school telephone hanging on the wall with a wire. And that kind of telephone only works if the connection goes all the way to the other end. So if you're calling London, I mean, think about this, calling China. I mean, this is why phone calls were so expensive, right? It took a lot of infrastructure to do that. Now, over time, scientists and engineers understood that there was a better and more affordable way to transmit information. And it had a lot to do with the nuclear arms race. The nuclear arms race was the motivation to come up with modern networking. On that note, we're going to end our class. But what I want you to understand are these first 2 pages. I want you to read this, take a look at the diagrams, right? And then read the rest of this and tell me if it makes sense or not. On Friday, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story about how our internet evolved from the Cold War, our nuclear arms race with Russia. We wouldn't have the internet today if it wasn't for a very dark period in American history. It was, it's kind of a weird period of history. But I actually participated in that arms race. I'm 62 years old. I was a young lieutenant in 1984 in Germany. And the Cold War was still not, well, really wasn't so cold. There was a lot of really underhanded, a lot of secret things that were playing out. It wasn't an open war, but it was a war. People lost their lives during the Cold War, more than most realize. And everybody was afraid of a nuclear war, right? Everybody was afraid of somebody striking first and then the whole planet melting down in a big mushroom cloud. I'm not going to go into those details right now, but I want to hold that thought, and that's where we're going to pick up on Friday. Are there any questions about what we've referred to so far in this session? Any
I
questions?
guess this is more of a abstract one. Kind of like what you just said about the Cold War and how the internet or communication developed because of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like what's happening now with just as an example, Starlink, being, satellite internet provider? Is that kind of like revolutionizing the internet and telecommunications? Because without it, Ukraine probably wouldn't be in the position it is right now, because they said that it really helped with communication. It really helped with sending reports, making sure that positions were accurate.
Right.
And are we moving more towards satellite internet, I guess?
Well, so that's a great question. And the short answer is there is a parallel. The observation you've drawn from recent events to the Cold War previously is actually really on point. And there are a lot of parallels, and I think it's great that you shared that. One of the things about telecommunications and digital networking is that the media, the means by which the ones and zeros travel, right? So networking is about ones and zeros in motion. When you're talking about computers and data storage, that's where ones and zeros are static. They're not going anywhere. But anytime you have ones and zeros moving, you have a network. And so the media has constantly changed and updated. If you remember original 3G cell phones, everybody was like ecstatic when they came out with 4G LTE cellular service. And so this is where the industry is really breaking barriers. And yes, the only difference in this case, Milrain, is that Elon Musk was going to have his satellite network and Starlink, he was going to have that before the Ukrainian conflict arose. But there's no question that he has the acceleration of his network development has been, it's been spurred on by the Ukrainian war. So in a similar fashion, the world conflict we're watching right now, it's accelerating a whole new way of networking. And I don't know if satellite's going to replace everything. We'll get to fiber optics in a later session, but that's terrestrial.
Right. Yeah. You like fiber. Well, I don't know. That's for another class, I guess. I was going to ask, is that like faster than Starlink? But yeah, I mean, they're both pretty.
It is and it isn't. On the back end, ultimately, the satellites have to connect to something, and they're connecting to fiber. And I don't think that's ever going to change. And there's a very important reason for that. When we get to fiber, I'll explain that. But fiber is fiber is never going to go away. But the satellite methods are new, and it's a welcome development. I hope to get Starlink in March when my contract is up. So, well, any other questions or observations? Thank you for joining us.